Hare Krishna. The devotees who spoke prior to my speaking, and surely those who'll speak after me, they spoke so deeply and in a heartfelt and so deep and instructive. I want to express my appreciation to each of those devotees. I thought of speaking about in somewhat of a different mood, but mentioning 3 different moods of Srila Prabhupada, because being a person means to have different moods. Even Krishna has different moods that manifest Dhira Lalita, Dhira Datta, different moods. So Srila Prabhupada had different moods. In one mood, he was like a lion. When he was representing Srila Vyasadeva sitting on the Vyasasana, he was like a lion. In Japan, in Kobe, he did such extraordinary things, but when we approached him after, I'll just mention the extraordinary thing he did in the middle of a lecture given by a Mayavadi sannyasi in Kobe with a gathering of about 500 Indian merchants. In the middle of his lecture, Prabhupada looked at his few disciples who were sitting there and said, "Stop him." Now, who in the world could do that? And we did what he said. We just started kirtan in the middle of his lecture, and he stopped speaking. And then when we asked Prabhupada why he listened for a half hour and then suddenly said, "Stop him," because the lecture was in Hindi and none of us could speak Hindi who were present, Prabhupada replied that first he was lecturing all right, which showed his lack of fanaticism. And then he said, he started speaking about Pancha Upasaka and how beyond Vishnu there is Brahman. And when he said that, Prabhupada said, "I could not tolerate it." It wasn't the words of a religious fanatic again. It was the words of a lover. He could not tolerate hearing that something was beyond Krishna. And he stopped him. And then he said, "When I'm out, I'm like a lion. And when I'm home, I'm like a lamb." Different moods. One lion mood of Srila Prabhupada's was I saw in Melbourne in 1975. And Prabhupada was sitting on the Vyasasana, so tall and strong. And he was lecturing so strong on the Bhagavatam. And he mentioned a point that's mentioned in the 5th canto of the Bhagavatam. It's somewhat not a major point, but it's a point that's mentioned that there are giant eagles that fly from planet to planet, and they hatch their eggs in the friction of the atmosphere. So Prabhupada was sitting tall on the Vyasasana and he said this. And at the end of the class, he looked at all the mostly young devotees who were sitting in front of him and also the guests. And he said, "Are there any questions?" And one relatively newly initiated disciple slowly, and we could say either bravely or we could say foolishly, raised his hand. And he said to Prabhupada, "You mentioned in your lecture that there are giant eagles that fly from planet to planet and hatch their eggs in the atmosphere." And then he said to Prabhupada, "That is a little hard to believe." And Prabhupada just looked at him and said, "What do you know? You are still in the womb of your mother." And I can't speak for the rest of the souls who were listening, but at least one soul went like this. Later I met that devotee. He was finished after that. But Prabhupada's mood was to protect the Siddhanta, the conclusions of Shastra. But in a different mood, also in Japan, when Prabhupada passed through Hong Kong, I had given him a ring. And it was at a difficult time during ISKCON, and Prabhupada had actually dissolved the GBC during that time for something that they had done. And myself, in my somewhat naivety and innocence, and I thought I should try and encourage Prabhupada. It was well-intentioned, but it was innocent. So I bought Prabhupada a gold ring, 24-karat gold ring, and on that ring it said Jai ISKCON. And so when Prabhupada was in Hong Kong, I gave it to him. And then I traveled with Srila Prabhupada to Japan. And in Japan, he was taking massage, and Sudama Prabhu was giving him massage, and I was the only other person in the room. And Prabhupada, he was getting massage, and Sudama noticed that he was wearing a new ring. So he said to Prabhupada, "Oh, Prabhupada, you have a new ring." And Prabhupada said, "Yes." And then he said to, Sudama said to Prabhupada, "Who gave it to you?" And it was only the three of us sitting in the room. And Prabhupada just turned his head and looked at me, and then replied to Sudama, "Oh, someone." He just turned that moment into the most intimate exchange. And a third mood of Prabhupada's, which His Holiness Lokanath Maharaj spoke about so importantly, when Prabhupada it was time for him to leave this world, and the devotees asked Prabhupada, as I remember it, Maharaj gave some details. They asked Prabhupada, "Should we ask all your disciples to come?" And Prabhupada said, "Yes, they should all come." And then a devotee said, "Well, that would be very difficult because everyone loves you, and everyone will come. And then what will happen to the temples if everyone comes?" And Prabhupada, in his deep and very sober way, replied that the test of how much they love me will be their cooperation after I depart. And that, in my opinion, it turned out to be such a difficult thing to do, and it sounds so simple to cooperate. But it's so difficult because, in my understanding, is because you have to give up your own thoughts and your own convenience and your own conviction that this is the only way to do everything, and not compromise the principles, but compromise details on how things should be done. And that is the test. A very big test and perhaps very difficult to do, but that is the test because the movement is so important. I heard Prabhupada say in Hawaii in 1976, his final visit there, that the forces of evil are so strong in this world, so strong. And if we fragment, if people leave, and if they leave, then we will become weak. So therefore, Prabhupada wanted us to cooperate and stay together and stay strong because our mission is so important for the world. Hare Krishna. Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna,